A cold corridor winds beneath the old stones of the Bastille, each footstep swallowed by centuries of silence. The air is thick with lime, mildew, and something else, something nameless. In a cell no larger than a coffin, a man once sat unmoving, his face sealed in a prison more cruel than walls, an iron mask without a key. They say, no one saw his face. They say, no one dared to speak his name. He came with the dusk and was buried in shadow. The guards who brought his meals were forbidden to look him in the eye. The jailers were rotated, their tongues cut loose from curiosity, by threats sharper than any blade. Not even the birds perched on the Bastille's high stones could sing of him, for even the wind that passed his cell returned hushed. What power, what secret, what bloodline could demand such relentless silence? It is here that the myth takes its first breath, like a candle flickering behind a mirror. The man in the iron mask. A name carved not in stone, but in whisper and wonder. A name that never lived in the light. Yet behind that mask was flesh. Behind that silence, a voice once cried out in the dark. He was not born in chains. The story begins not in the prison, but in a palace, one bathed in golden light, beneath ceilings where angels danced and courtiers moved like shadows. France, 17th century, the age of absolutism. The throne of Louis XIV stood high, casting long shadows over every soul beneath it. The Sun King, they called him, radiant, divine, eternal. But even the sun has its eclipses. Some say the prisoner was his brother. Others claim he was a noble betrayed by secrets too volatile for parchment. There were those who whispered he was the king himself, switched at birth with a twin to protect the line from a scandal that would shatter the throne. Myths breed like fire in the dry woods of tyranny. We do not begin with answers. We begin with fear. A fear so deep that a man's face had to be hidden from the world forever. A fear so absolute that the very idea of his existence became a threat to the divine order of kings. The archives tell us of a masked prisoner transferred in the dead of night from one fortress to another. He traveled under heavy guard, his face never seen, his identity kept even from those who fed and dressed him. His name changed with each passing year. Marchiali, Heir, Eustache Doger. But none of them were true. They were names borrowed, stitched into silence. The Bastille was merely his last tomb. Before that, he haunted the towers of Pignerol, Exilles, Sainte Marguerite. A shadow without past or future. Even his death was hidden. Buried under false inscriptions. Laid to rest under a name that meant nothing. Yet history does not sleep. It shifts in its grave. And over the centuries, historians, poets, conspirators, and dreamers have clawed at the mask with questions. Who was he? Why was he erased? And most terrifying of all, what truth was so unbearable that it demanded the destruction of his very identity? We must follow the shadow backwards. We must walk into the gilded halls of Versailles, where portraits lie and silence reigns. We must listen not to what was written, but to what was left out. In the tapestry of royal archives, in the quiet between the lines, something stirs. A buried thread, a forgotten breath, a second heartbeat in the cradle, and the mask begins to tremble. The mask begins to tremble. Because the lie it hides is older than iron, older than law, woven not in chains, but in lineage. In the hush of Versailles, beneath the chandeliers and painted ceilings, the myth waits in plain sight. 2 cradles, 1 crown, and a mother who did not weep. Anne of Austria bore the Sun King after years of desperate prayers. Louis Dieudonné, they named him Louis, the God-given, the miracle child, the heir to France. But a single line in a letter from that era sparks fire even now. All went well with the births, it says. Not birth. Births. In that one quiet plural, generations have seen a doorway. A possibility that Anne bore not one child, but two. Twins. Twins were a problem for kings. For in the ancient rites of monarchy, the firstborn is sacred. The second is dangerous. A twin undermines the divine right, creates ambiguity, threatens the clarity on which empires are built. If two were born, one had to vanish. One had to be erased not only from titles and inheritance, but from memory itself. So what if the mask did not hide a crime, but a claim? This idea is not a modern fantasy. It haunted minds even in the Sun King's lifetime. Voltaire, the philosopher whose tongue was too sharp for comfort, speculated boldly that the masked prisoner was indeed the twin of Louis XIV. A man who bore too close a resemblance to the king, he wrote. Dangerous resemblance, dangerous blood. The mystery grows deeper with the man who kept him, Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. A jailer of unusual devotion, he served as governor of multiple fortresses, and in each one the masked man appeared, transferred in darkness, watched with reverence. Even in exile, Saint-Mars treated this prisoner not as a common criminal, but as someone noble, as someone royal. His cells were often furnished. He was fed well, dressed well, his linen fine, his quarters silent. Not torture, containment. Saint-Mars followed him across decades and provinces, from Pignerol to Exilles to Sainte-Marguerite, then finally to the Bastille. Always with the same care, the same secrecy, as if guarding not a man, but a sacred flame. The mask was not iron at first. That came later, in the final years. Earlier accounts speak of black velvet, soft and light, meant not for punishment, but concealment. It was only in the cruel echo of memory that the velvet became steel. And what of the king? Louis XIV never acknowledged the masked man, but he did send letters, sealed and personal, regarding him. He ensured his silence with orders whispered down the chain of command. Let no one speak to him. Let no one know his name. Let him be forgotten. The cruelty of that forgetting is a violence beyond dungeons. To erase a man is to exile his soul. And yet, he endured. For over 30 years, the masked man lived like a ghost inside a living body. No visitors, no letters, no trial, no past, only the ticking of time and the weight of the mask against his breath. And still the world noticed. In Parisian salons, rumors blossomed like night flowers. Was he a nobleman who knew too much, a foreign agent, a disgraced general? Or was he the king's brother, hidden not because of a crime, but because of a birth? Each version came dressed in new clothes, yet beneath them all was the same pale skeleton. Someone once powerful had been made to disappear. We are not chasing a face. We are chasing a wound. One inflicted at the very heart of royal power. The deeper we follow, the less it becomes a question of who he was, and more a question of why such secrecy was needed at all. The truth may not lie in archives, but in patterns, in echoes, and the mask continues to tremble. Because in the silence surrounding it, something stirs, something not bound to one man, but to a kingdom's secret guilt. France was built on spectacle, gold leaf, marble halls, royal pageants. But beneath the velvet, there is always blood. Behind every throne, a shadow. The masked prisoner is no longer just a man. He is the fracture in the illusion of divine rule. Let us return, then, to the man who watched over him. Saint-Mars was no ordinary jailer. He was a man trusted with invisible burdens. From fortress to fortress, his presence was marked not by cruelty, but by loyalty to something higher than law. The masked man traveled with him like a sacred relic, hidden, guarded, forbidden. Their relationship was strange, respectful, almost reverent. St. Mars ensured the prisoner's comfort, reported his health to the crown, protected his secret, with a silence more durable than chains. Even his burial was a deception. When the man in the iron mask died in 1703, he was buried under the name Marchioli, a name that meant nothing, tied to no lineage, no titles, no land. A false name for a man whose real name could not be spoken. His cell was scrubbed, his possessions destroyed, and his face never revealed to the world. But the rumors outlived the marble of his tomb. What does it mean to erase a person so completely? It means he mattered. For a man to be hidden so long, his existence denied and rewritten, he must have threatened something immense. Not a secret of war or a scandal of love, but a truth so corrosive it could unravel the legitimacy of a dynasty. If the mask hit a twin, it hit a double. And doubles are dangerous because they blur what power needs to keep clear. Who is the king and who is not? And then there are the portraits. In the galleries of Versailles, dozens of portraits line the walls. Louis XIV as a youth, Louis in armor, Louis as the radiant sun. Yet some say a few of these images do not match. Subtle differences in the nose, the eyes, the spacing of the brows. Some art historians have whispered that not all these images depict the same man. That a few of them, perhaps, were painted of someone else. Someone who had to be hidden. And always, the rumors returned to birth. The midwives of the royal court were silent. But one diary, now lost, was said to contain a single troubling line. 2 cries were heard. Only one was celebrated. Imagine the terror of a mother told she could not keep both children. Imagine the silence of a court sworn to pretend that one child had never existed. Imagine being the child who was born second, whose only crime was to arrive moments too late. If the prisoner was that child, then the mask was not a punishment. It was a curse, a device to protect the illusion that monarchy is ordained, unbroken, pure. If the people saw a second face with the same blood, the same eyes, the same divine right, what then? Would they question the king? Would the empire fracture? The mask ensured that no one would ever ask, that even in death, the illusion would remain intact. But illusions decay. They rot from within, even when plated in gold. And the memory of the masked man, though buried, began to rise. In Parisian salons, in whispered tales passed from nursemaids to children, the legend returned, more powerful than any edict. The story refused to die because it wasn't just a story. It was a question, one that still lingers. What if the king had a brother? What if the crown sat on the wrong head? What if the mask was not iron, but a mirror? The more we chase the story, the less it behaves like a history, and the more it twists like a dream. It refuses to hold still. What began as a tale of one forgotten prisoner begins to unravel into something stranger, more elusive, a myth within a myth. Because there is another possibility, buried deep in the folds of royal deception, that there was never a twin at all. What if the man in the iron mask was not a brother, but a reflection? The mind breaks long before the body, and inside the golden cage of kingship, identity is a fragile thing. Louis XIV, crowned as a child, raised in suspicion, and surrounded by betrayal, had to become more than human to survive. He had to become a symbol, a god on earth. But gods are not born, they are made, and the making leaves scars. Some scholars have posed a radical theory that the man in the mask may have been Louis himself, not permanently, not in the body, but for a time, during a moment of madness, scandal, or illness. That in a moment of crisis, the real king was hidden away, and a double was elevated to rule in his place. The mask, then, was not to hide a twin, but to protect the illusion of an unbroken monarch. There is a letter, unverified, untranslated for decades, suggesting that during a brief window in the late 1660s, the king vanished from court. His presence explained only by vague mentions of illness, retreats, divine contemplation. Yet the affairs of state continued. Decrees were signed, edicts issued, but those close to the king remarked, in private, on his change in tone, his strange silence, his shifting mannerisms. It was said that for weeks, Louis walked differently, spoke with hesitation. His eyes darted instead of commanding. He smiled too often. He blinked when addressed. Traits that had never belonged to the young monarch before. Could it be that someone else wore the crown during that time? And if so, what happened to the original? If this theory holds weight, then the prisoner in the mask was not born of rival blood, but of royal identity itself. A man used, then discarded. A placeholder. A phantom of the throne. His crime was not rebellion, but becoming the face of the king. And when the real Louis returned, he could not allow the ghost to linger. Thus, the mask. Not just to hide the face, but to erase the memory. A symbol to cauterize the wound. A reminder that the divine right of kings is not to be impersonated. That anyone who steps into the sun must pay the price of fire. This interpretation explains the peculiar care given to the prisoner. Why he was never tortured. Why he was always fed well, treated with quiet respect. Why his jailer acted more like a guardian than a warden. It explains the fear, not of what he might do, but of what he once was. A man who had tasted the throne. A man who had worn the sun and lived. And what if he came to believe it? What if, in those long years, the man behind the mask forgot his origin, but remembered the throne? Remembered being obeyed, being adored, being powerful? What if the iron mask was not to conceal his identity, but to trap his delusion, to make him forget? Or worse, to make the world forget? This is the paradox that trembles at the heart of the myth. The prisoner may have been royal, or he may have been nothing. But either way, he held too much resemblance to power to be allowed a face. Because in kingdoms built on image, a mask is not a punishment. It is protection. For everyone else. But protection from what? From a face that looked too much like power? Or from a truth that no one could survive? Let us step back into the Bastille. Not the real prison of stone and brick, but the symbolic one. The Bastille of myth. In this cell, the mask is no longer steel. It is metaphor. It covers not only a man's face, but the face of history itself. And history, as we know, is rarely honest. It is sculpted, edited, and gilded to serve thrones. This is where the contradiction breathes. The prisoner was treated too well to be forgotten, yet too secretly to be honored. He was both no one and someone, a shadow that left footprints, a ghost with a heartbeat. The letters from Saint-Mars, now faded and brittle, show an anxiety that borders on devotion. He describes the prisoner's health, his appetite, even the quality of his sheets. No other inmate received such obsessive attention. If he were merely a nobleman or a spy, why such reverence? If he were only a tool discarded, why keep him alive so long? Unless he was a reflection of something the king feared in himself. A monarch cannot afford fractures. Louis XIV had built his rule on the illusion of unity, himself as the absolute center, the state embodied. L'état c'est moi, he famously declared. I am the state. But what happens when the state has a second face? One that was once seated in the center, one that might remember being the state? This is the terrifying contradiction at the story's heart. Either the prisoner was a twin, denied by birth, or he was a double, discarded by necessity. Both are unacceptable. Both threaten the divine order. And so, the solution: isolation. Silence. A life so buried in secrecy that even the grave could not speak it aloud. Yet the cracks remain. Contemporary accounts from court insiders, servants, scribes, and exiles speak of whispers behind the tapestries. One such whisper tells of a valet dismissed without reason, after catching a glimpse of the king dressing. There were 2 scars, he is said to have told his sister, but His Majesty has only ever had one. Another speaks of a royal physician summoned not to Versailles, but to a fortress, whose name was never recorded. Details like these are not facts. They are echoes, but echoes persist only when something speaks first. And what of the prisoner himself? There are no writings from him, no confessions, no last words. But the absence itself says something, that he did not resist, that he did not try to escape, that he endured year after year in silence. Not with rage, but with a strange kind of resignation, as if he understood, as if he knew his role. Because what if he believed in the mask? What if he wore it, not only because it was forced upon him, but because it became part of who he was? What if, after years of concealment, he forgot what his own face looked like or feared it? What if he believed the myth they told him, that he was dangerous, that the world must never know? The final contradiction then is this: the mask hid him to protect the world. But over time, it may have protected him from the world as well. Perhaps the most unbearable truth is not that he was a twin, not that he ruled in secret, not even that he was erased, but that he became the mask, and in doing so, ceased to be a man at all. This is where the myth dissolves into something deeper, something beneath history, beneath rumor, beneath identity. Because the man in the iron mask is not just a prisoner in a cell. He is a symbol, an archetype, a truth we bury when it becomes too dangerous to bear. Every culture has its masked figure, the one who is present but not visible, alive but not known. From the Greek tragedy's faceless chorus to the veiled gods of Egyptian lore, to the jester who speaks truth from behind paint, the mask is older than kings, older than power. It is not merely to hide, it is to transform. To wear a mask is to shed the self, to step outside the boundaries of name, memory, even morality. The mask frees and binds. It permits and forbids. It grants the wearer a new role and takes from him the right to remove it. The man in the iron mask, then, is not just one man. He is every man who has been erased, denied, silenced, until silence becomes his only voice. In this light, the iron becomes ritual, a sacrifice, a rite of containment. Not to imprison the body, but to trap the dangerous thing that cannot be allowed to walk free. The double. The one who mirrors power. The one who shows the truth, that power does not want seen, that it is fragile, arbitrary, and always afraid of its reflection. Carl Jung, the great analyst of myth and mind, would have called the masked man a shadow, the part of the king that cannot be owned, yet must be exiled, the part that threatens the illusion of wholeness. In this story, the Sun King plays his part with golden precision, while his dark mirror rots in isolation. But both are necessary. One cannot exist without the other. Every king has his ghost, Every throne has its curse. And so the story becomes not about politics or succession, but about identity itself. Who are we when no one sees us? What do we become when our names are taken? If the prisoner lived for decades behind a mask, in silence without even his own reflection, did he continue to exist as a person, or did he become a function, an echo, a memory of something that might have been? Here the myth touches all of us. Because we too wear masks. We are taught them from childhood. What to say, how to behave, when to smile, when to be quiet. We mask our rage, our fear, our desire, our shame. And sometimes, if we wear the mask too long, we forget what's beneath. The man in the iron mask is not just a legend of France. He is the myth of the buried self. The face that was once yours, but now lies hidden beneath duty, obedience, expectation. He represents the cost of conformity taken to its extreme, the soul suffocated beneath the iron weight of what others demand we be. And yet, there is power in this archetype. Because even sealed in darkness, the prisoner was never destroyed. He endured. Decade after decade, he remained. Quiet, yes, but not broken, not erased. The mask may have hidden his face, but it could not kill the question. The question is, what lives? The question is, what haunts? Not who he was, but what he means. Because buried beneath the mask is not just a face. It is a fracture in the soul of France. A split that was never mended. A silence mistaken for peace. And it is in this silence that forgotten truths begin to rot, sending their scent through history like myrrh at a funeral. There is an old idea in mystical thought that to erase a person is to damage the soul of the collective, not just of the one erased, but of the society that permits it. In Talmudic lore, to save one life is to save the world entire, but to deny one life is to create a wound in the fabric of being. The man in the iron mask was not just erased. He was preserved in absence. He became a wound that was never allowed to bleed. We must now return to the year 1662. That year, a man named Eustache Dauger entered the records of Pignerol prison. He was the first shadow in this myth. His name appears in the letters of Saint Mars, but always with caution, always surrounded by mystery. Some said he was a valet who knew too much. Others whispered of royal scandals, forbidden affairs, or secrets of state finance. But none of these justified decades of masked isolation. Unless Dauger was not the beginning, but the mask for the beginning. A name to cover another. This practice was not uncommon. In times of crisis, the French court often used aliases to bury scandal. Children of noblemen born out of wedlock were given new names and sent into cloisters. Political threats were disguised as madmen, buried in asylums. Names, in this context, were weapons. To name a thing was to either bless it or destroy it. And so the names given to the masked man, Dauger, Marchioli, may have been chosen not for what they revealed, but for what they concealed. And what was being concealed? A moment, a decision, a birth perhaps, or an act of substitution. Perhaps something as small as a midwife's whisper, or as large as a forged decree. But whatever it was enough to alter the very structure of monarchy, enough to require a man to disappear completely, yet not die. This too is strange, because death would have been easier. A discreet poison, a burial without record, and the problem vanishes. But they did not kill him. They watched him, guarded him, fed him, for over 30 years, which means he was not a threat in the ordinary sense. He was a sacred danger, the kind of danger you cannot destroy without destroying something in yourself. This is the paradox at the heart of ritual silence. In ancient cultures, kings did not simply rule. They embodied the health of the land. Their bodies were vessels, their presence divine. To harm such a vessel, even if flawed, risked cosmic imbalance. So perhaps the masked man was not kept alive out of mercy, but out of necessity. His breath maintained the illusion. His suffering preserved the spell. And France, at that time, was obsessed with balance. The Enlightenment had not yet dawned. Reason was rising, but it had not dethroned mystery. And mystery, when it could not be explained, had to be locked away. Behind doors, behind masks, in oubliettes and towers, not for justice, for preservation. This is the spiritual cost of forgetting. A civilization cannot mutilate truth without maiming itself, and the longer it hides the wound, the deeper it festers. The man in the mask became the tumor they could not excise, the hidden child of empire, whose silence echoed in every chamber of Versailles. The mask may have had no mouth, but it screamed. And what it screamed was not only pain, it was memory. Memory so dangerous that it had to be locked away, not because it was false, but because it was true. For centuries we have asked, who was the man in the iron mask? But the more dangerous question may be, what did he know? There is a theory, whispered in certain forbidden texts, that the prisoner was not erased because of his identity, but because of his knowledge. Not a twin, not a double, but a witness, a keeper of secrets, too great for parchment. Some say he was a messenger between courts, a man who had served in places where kings speak plainly, where alliances are forged not in treaties, but in beds and blood. According to this version, the prisoner had seen something he was never meant to see. Perhaps not just one betrayal, but a lattice of them. A network of lies woven through France's most sacred institutions. Secret births, hidden affairs, heretical rites performed in the corridors of Versailles. Some claim he was involved in what later came to be known as l'affaire des poisons, a vast scandal of nobles dabbling in black masses, poisons, and occult rituals to gain power. The Sun King's court was not only a theater of reason, it was a temple of illusion. To sustain the performance, all dissenting knowledge had to be burned or masked. But this man was not burned. He was preserved. Why? Because some truths, if destroyed, become martyrs. But if they are silenced, if they are discredited or buried beneath absurd mystery, they become legends. Harmless. A curiosity. The Iron Mask was not only a shield against recognition, it was a veil of confusion, a narrative so strange, so contradictory, that it swallowed its own meaning. And so, the second twist, what if the prisoner was not the forgotten heir, but the rightful judge? Not the twin of the king, but the mirror of the kingdom's corruption. In this light, he becomes more than man. He becomes symbol, the scapegoat, the exiled conscience, the holy fool who sees too much. In ancient societies, such figures were sacrificed in ritual to cleanse the sins of the people. But in France, by the 17th century, sacrifice had become unfashionable. So instead of killing the scapegoat, they imprisoned him, not to destroy him, to hold him, to keep the stain hidden, contained, away from the altar of empire. But symbols leak. Over time, even silence begins to echo. A name repeated too often in mystery becomes prophecy. And so the mask, meant to erase, became a magnet. It drew the curious, the rebellious, the broken-hearted. It whispered to poets, revolutionaries, madmen. It said, "There is a truth beneath your world that no one is allowed to see." And perhaps this is why the story never died. not because of who the man was, but because of what he represented. The one who sees and cannot be unseen. The one who knows and cannot be believed. The one who was buried alive, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, too soon. This is not the story of a failed king. It is the story of a dangerous witness. And in the mythology of kingdoms, there is nothing more terrifying than a witness who survives. Because a witness cannot be argued with. A witness carries no theory, only presence. The mask did not simply hide his features, it severed him from the world of time, leaving behind a living question. And that question began to reflect not just the crimes of a king, but the silence of an entire people. The man in the iron mask became a mirror, not of one man's sins, but of a society's refusal to look inward. In every era, there is something we agree not to see. A truth so unbearable we hide it in fiction, in folklore, in forgotten cells. France chose to forget the man, but the myth remained. And myths have longer lives than monarchs. The French Revolution would arrive nearly a century later, like a cleansing fire. Heads rolled, palaces burned, and the divine right of kings was shattered. But even then, the mask remained. In pamphlets, in plays, in underground songs whispered among prisoners in new dungeons. He never spoke, they would say, but he saw everything. This is the shift. We no longer ask, who was he? We begin to ask, what does he remember? In this new lens, the mask becomes a vessel for memory. Not personal, but collective. The weight of a people's unspoken knowledge, sealed in silence. Just as trauma passes through generations, so does denial. The mask is the lid on the jar of everything France could not confront about itself. Think of it. A nation that claimed divine order, yet murdered its own prophets. A court obsessed with reason, yet filled with shadows and rights. A crown that demanded loyalty, but offered only masks. And so the man becomes less and less an individual, and more an archetype, a hollow center that draws the projections of the age. In some centuries, he is a political victim. In others, a secret royal. In some, a warning. In others, a curse. But always, he is the one who carries what cannot be spoken aloud. Jung called this the burden of the collective unconscious, a psychic wound, sealed by story, re-emerging in symbols and dreams. The masked man is no longer just in France. He appears in novels, in operas, in films across the world. Every culture, it seems, adopts its own version of him. He is Zorro. He is V. He is the Phantom of the Opera, the face denied, the voice stolen, the truth hidden behind steel or shadow. And this, finally, is the second transformation. The man in the iron mask is not just a victim. He is memory itself. Memory exiled, locked away, because it did not fit the narrative, because it said too much, because it would not die quietly. And maybe that is why the myth lives on. Not because we need to solve it, but because we need it unsolved. A riddle without answer, a face without name, a warning with no fixed meaning. Because as long as the mask remains, so does the question. Not just who was behind it, but what are we hiding now? What is our mask? What truth have we locked away, buried in a modern Bastille of denial, technology, and distraction? And who among us, today, wears that mask? Not of iron, but of silence. This is the final twist. The man in the iron mask was never just a man. He is us, not literally, but symbolically, profoundly. We who live in the age of faces, of voices broadcast and selves performed. We who curate our image so carefully, protect our secrets so fiercely, and yet find ourselves more isolated, more voiceless than ever before. In our world, the mask has become digital. It glows, it scrolls, it listens, it smiles when we do not. We wear it not by force but by choice. We craft profiles, avatars, brands. We are seen everywhere, and yet we vanish. Beneath all the light, a darkness gathers. Because behind the performance, behind the perfection, many of us feel exiled from our true selves. This is why the story will not die. Because we now understand the mask not as a cage made by kings, but as a ritual passed down through centuries of fear. Fear of being known, fear of being erased, fear that if we show our real face, the world will turn away, and so we do it to ourselves. We silence our dreams, we edit our truths, we imprison our pain, we keep the mask polished, well-fed, obedient. We decorate our cells and call them castles, and we tell ourselves, this is freedom. But some part of us knows better, because deep inside, the prisoner stirs. Not the historical man, not the royal twin, not the secret witness, but the archetype, the soul that remembers who we were before the mask, the voice that once sang freely, that once believed it could be seen without consequence. And like the prisoner, that voice still waits. It waits behind our public selves. It waits behind compliance, behind social codes, behind the images we share. It waits for us to ask, not just who the man in the iron mask was, but why we let him be forgotten. And perhaps this is the final horror of his story. Not the mask, not the silence, but that the world let it happen. That his name was buried, his story twisted, his breath taken for granted. That an entire nation agreed, passively, to unsee him. How many others have we unseen? How many truths have we looked away from? Because to see them would force us to change. How many inconvenient voices have we allowed to be locked away? Not in towers, but in algorithms, in prisons, in shame. The mask now lives in law, in media, in memory. It is worn by the whistleblower, the exile, the forgotten elder, the unheeded child. It is worn by the one whose truth is too raw, too complex, too threatening to the illusion of normalcy. And yet still, beneath the weight, truth breathes. It does not shout. It waits. Like the prisoner, it endures the years, the silence, the distortion, because truth has no clock. It does not wither. It does not beg. It waits for the door to open, the lock to shift, the eyes to look again. So we return to the Bastille, not to escape, but to remember, not to solve the mystery, but to accept it. That behind the stories we inherit, there are always silences, and behind every silence, a face, waiting to be seen. So let us look now, not with the eyes of curiosity or scandal, but with reverence. Let us return to the cell, not as historians, not as conspirators, but as pilgrims. Because behind the mask, there was still breath, still hunger, still warmth. And the longer we stare into the myth, the more we see not a monster or a mystery, but a man. He woke each day to the same dim light, the same stone walls, the same plate of food slid through the door. He did not speak, not because he could not, but because no one would hear. He did not weep, not because he was strong, but because tears need witnesses, and he had none. His life was not a legend. It was a slow unspooling of silence. He had a name once, even if we do not know it. He had a mother, a lullaby, a first word, a memory of sunlight. He may have laughed. He may have been cruel. He may have been kind. All of that was taken, not by death, but by forgetting. And forgetting is the cruelest form of exile. Death at least has finality, a burial, a ritual. But to be forgotten while still alive is to become a ghost of yourself, a soul in limbo. Each day, he breathed, He became more story than man, more symbol than body. But his ribs still rose, his fingernails still grew, his dreams, perhaps, remained intact. We forget, in our obsession with identity, that he was human. We chase titles, prince, twin, traitor, witness, like wolves. But these labels are blindfolds. They keep us from seeing what matters. That he was alive, that he suffered, that he endured something we can barely imagine. Decades, not of torment, but of negation. There are many kinds of violence. Some leave scars, others leave nothing. The violence done to him was of the second kind. It erased without cutting. It silenced without striking. It made him into a question, not a memory. But somewhere in that cell, there must have been a moment when he touched the mask with trembling fingers and remembered his face. Not its shape, its being. A fragment of self that had not been devoured by silence. Perhaps a melody hummed under his breath, a phrase from childhood, a dream of a garden. These are the final sanctuaries, the places even a mask cannot reach. Because no matter how deep the exile, some ember always survives. And that ember is sacred. That ember is what the world tried to smother, but could not. He may not have written it down. He may not have spoken it aloud, but it glowed in him. A spark of identity that no iron could crush. A defiance not of rage, but of memory. A soul refusing to vanish. And perhaps, in that, he triumphed. Not by escaping. Not by being revealed, but by remaining. By being real in a world that demanded his erasure. By keeping the ember alive until we, centuries later, might notice the smoke. The mask was meant to contain him, but it could not contain the meaning. And meaning, once set loose, travels in strange ways. It seeps through walls. It echoes down generations. It enters the bloodstream of a culture, like a forgotten name, suddenly remembered in a dream. The man in the iron mask may never have been freed in life, but in myth, he escaped. He escaped the cell. He escaped the silence. He entered us, because somewhere in the prison of our own hearts, we recognize him. We may never wear an iron mask, but we know what it means to be unseen. We know the ache of being misunderstood, mislabeled, misremembered. We know what it means to be told, you must not speak, not with chains, but with indifference. And that too is a kind of mask. So we return to the cell not to rescue him, but to rescue ourselves. To sit with his memory, not as scholars, but as kin. To look into that terrible mirror and ask, whose silence have I accepted? Whose erasure have I allowed? Because if one man could be forgotten so completely, so deliberately, then forgetting is not an accident. It is a mechanism, a ritual, a choice, made by societies that prefer comfort to truth. And it is not limited to kings. It happens everywhere, every day, to the poor, the displaced, the ill, the abused, the inconvenient. We silence them, not with masks of iron, but with words like unstable, irrelevant, unknown. We build cells of bureaucracy. We feed them just enough to keep them alive, then keep them out of sight. And when we remember them, we turn them into myths, stripped of pain, stripped of agency, safe to consume, easy to forget again. But the truth, once buried, ferments. It does not die. It waits. And when it rises, it does not ask to be explained. It asks to be felt. The story of the masked man is no longer about solving a puzzle. It is about breaking a spell. A spell cast centuries ago, not by sorcerers, but by fear. The fear of losing control. The fear of looking into history and seeing our own reflection. Because what if the mask was not only put on him? What if it was also put on us? What if, in forgetting him, we forgot something of ourselves? some core of dignity, of conscience, of courage? What if the world became quieter, colder, less human the moment we accepted his silence as necessary? Then to remember him is an act of resistance. To remember is to reach through centuries of fog and say, "You mattered. You were real. Your breath was not wasted." And in that act, something shifts. The cell door does not creak open. The mask does not fall. But the story, his story, begins to glow with a different light. Not the light of royalty or revelation, but the quiet, sacred light of recognition. Recognition is what all forgotten things crave. It is the opposite of the mask. It is the name remembered, the pain acknowledged, the humanity restored. So we must look again, not to solve, but to honor. Not to unveil the face, but to say, "We see you." And in that seeing, something ancient stirs. Recognition is not merely memory, it is communion, a sacred exchange between what is lost and what remains. To see the forgotten is to welcome them back into the circle of the living. Not as relics, as witnesses, as kin. This is the great reversal. For centuries, we believed the prisoner was the one buried in darkness, cut off from the world. But perhaps it is we who were cut off from our empathy, from our capacity to bear uncomfortable truths. Perhaps the mask was not a wall between him and the world, but a veil drawn over our own eyes. And now it lifts. Not through revelation, but through reverence. Not by solving the riddle of his name, but by honoring the meaning of his silence. Because what is more human than the need to be seen? And what is more cruel than to be made invisible? We imagine history as a parade of names, but most of it is silence. Most lives leave no echo in books, no statue, no song. Most are buried under dust, beneath nations, beneath noise. And yet each of them breathed, a singular world, a flicker of the eternal. The man in the iron mask reminds us, not of what we've discovered, but of what we've lost by not looking closer. He is the face in the crowd that no one turned toward, the voice in the hall no one stopped to hear, the letter never sent, the child never named, the sorrow that had no witness. To remember him is to remember them, and to remember them is to remember us, because none of us are guaranteed remembrance. We live in a world that forgets with terrifying speed, a world that scrolls past grief, that edits pain, that demands performance and punishes truth. And in such a world, the greatest act of rebellion is not fame, not glory, but presence. To remain real, to feel deeply, to speak, even when the mask says, "You must not." And so, the man behind the iron mask becomes a guide, not to history, but to healing. He leads us through the corridors of power, past the facades of control, into the raw, trembling heart of what it means to be human, in a world that often refuses to care. He does not speak, but he teaches. He does not demand, but he reveals. And what he reveals is our own reflection. Can we bear it? Can we carry the weight of what we see? Not just his suffering, but the silence that allowed it. Because every forgotten soul holds a mirror. And when we finally look into it, we must ask, who did I not see? Who did I not hear? Whose story did I let slip away? The mask is not history. The mask is now. It is the barrier between one heart and another. It is the fear that keeps us distant, the shame that keeps us quiet. But if one man could endure that silence for a lifetime, then surely we can find the courage to listen, to see, to speak, not for him, but because of him. Because to remember is not a passive act. It is a sacred responsibility. And yet, here lies the paradox. The deeper we remember him, the less we need to know who he was. The closer we come to his truth, the more his name fades like mist in morning light. Because perhaps the greatest myth of all was that he needed to be unmasked to matter. What if the mask was not a punishment but a passage? What if, in stripping away name, title, and history, the man was made into something more enduring? Not a person, but a presence. Not a biography, but a symbol. Perhaps the very act, meant to erase him, elevated him beyond the reach of time. This is the final twist. That the prison was also a chrysalis, that beneath the iron shell, something ancient and luminous was being shaped, a soul forced into silence, but in that silence, becoming pure, untouched by politics, untouched by fame, a stillness so complete that it could carry meaning across centuries. What if his anonymity was not his tragedy, but his power? In a world obsessed with identity, with exposure, with names carved into stone, here was a man who left behind only a question. And in that question, we find ourselves. Because the mask does not say, "Look at him." It says, "Look within." And suddenly, all our assumptions collapse. The face we thought we needed to see no longer matters. The records, the documents, the genealogies, all of them feel small compared to the myth itself. Because the myth has become a ritual, a mirror, a test. Not of history, but of empathy. Can we love what we cannot name? Can we mourn a man without knowing his face? Can we feel for a stranger the way we feel for ourselves? These are not questions of identity. They are questions of soul. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because we crave answers, but because the story asks us to change, to become capable of deeper compassion, to develop eyes that see beyond surface, to honor lives not for what they achieve, but for what they endure. The irony is cruel and holy. They masked him to erase him, but the mask made him eternal. He became a figure unclaimed by any single story, unbound by any one truth. And in that emptiness, he became full, a container for all our projections, all our longings, all our buried grief. His silence absorbed the noise of an entire world and gave back stillness. Stillness is rare in stories. It frightens us. We expect climax, revelation, justice. But some stories are meant to end not in noise, but in breath, not in resolution, but in recognition. That the mystery is not meant to be solved, but lived. And so we return once more to the cell. The mask still on. The man still silent. But something in us is different now. We no longer demand he speak. We no longer need him to be a prince, a witness, a twin. We let him be. And in that letting go, we feel something open, something tender, something true. And in that quiet acceptance, we understand. The man in the iron mask was never meant to be solved. He was meant to be felt, not as a riddle with a key, but as a silence that deepens the longer you sit with it. His story does not end with revelation. It ends with reflection. What began as a mystery becomes a mirror. He came to us cloaked in legend, shrouded by theories, shadowed by royal intrigue. But what remains is something purer, a gesture of stillness, a monument not to power or lineage, but to endurance, to being unseen and yet never fully erased, to the sacred human capacity to persist even in exile. This is the paradox he leaves us with, that to be forgotten is not the same as to vanish, that silence is not emptiness, that absence can carry meaning as powerfully as presence. We are taught to look for heroes in the light, warriors, kings, prophets. But sometimes the greatest stories lie in the dark, in the figures who had everything stripped from them and yet retained a flicker of soul, a spark that could not be crushed, only concealed. a truth so simple it escapes the grasp of history. He was not remembered by name, but he was remembered. And in that, he wins, not against his captors, but against time. Because now, when we speak of the man in the iron mask, we speak of more than one man. We speak of every soul silenced by power, every life dismissed as inconvenient, every truth buried because it disrupted the illusion. We speak of the lost, the exiled, the erased, and in speaking we restore them. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to feel their presence as part of our own. Enough to learn from their silence. Enough to keep the ember alive. Perhaps that is the deepest purpose of myth. Not to explain, but to awaken. Not to answer, but to remind us of what we already know, but forget too easily that behind every mask is a human being, and behind every silence, a story worth hearing. We cannot change what was done to him, but we can change what is done to others now. We can listen more closely. We can name the forgotten. We can resist the urge to simplify, to categorize, to turn suffering into spectacle. And instead, we can witness it with tenderness, with reverence, with the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful act is simply to see and not look away. The mask remains, but we are different. We carry his silence now not as a burden, but as a vow, to protect what is vulnerable, to remember what was nearly lost, to feel what history tried to hide. Because in the end, he was never just one man in one cell. He was a question, and now he is an answer. Thank you for walking with me through the shadowed halls of myth and memory. This has been the story of the man in the iron mask, not as a riddle to solve, but as a silence to honor. If this journey moved you, I invite you to stay a while in the realm of forgotten lore. There are more voices waiting to be heard. Until then, thank you for your time, your attention, and your presence.